one of the things that's really clear is that it's in societies and communities where discrimination against women is present, which is in almost every community, and where equality of women remains a questionable goal, the worse off women are in a pre-conflict situation. It's almost clear that those are the women who will be worst affected if there is a crisis, a conflict, a humanitarian disaster of any kind. And it is because there are ways in which the patterns of discrimination that are embedded in a society and in a community are reflected in what happens to women in a conflict. But it's also because when people try to create programs for supporting women during a conflict and in periods of transition and then in a process of transformation, there's also a lack of consideration for the issues of embedded and institutionalized discrimination. So there's a way in which people try to create programs that will address the immediate needs of women, which are often simply categorized: food, shelter, clothing, access to health care, some protection. But our experience is that as long as there isn't also a concerted effort to deal with issues of embedded and institutionalized discrimination, then the capacity of a community, a society to develop a sustainable peace is always at question. In the three areas in which we always try to look at what's happening to women in conflict situations, one of them is clearly about the bodily integrity of women, and that includes the rape and sexual violence that happens in conflict situations, but it also includes a consideration of the exploitation of women's reproductive and sexual capacities and the range of things that happen to women because they are seen as reproducers, biological and cultural reproducers of the nation, if you like, or the community. So all the cases that we hear about forced rape, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, forced sterilization, people tell women, have the baby, don't have the baby, never have babies. In a conflict situation, it's always very loaded with what other people, and especially men and male-dominated and male-led institutional social structures, are thinking about what can be the role for women. A second piece of it is about what happens to women in the context of conflict when your environment, when your social and family environments are destroyed, where you lose your house, your livelihood, you're displaced, you lose all sense of community. I think one thing that really strikes me, having worked in Sri Lanka for many years in conflict situations, is that especially working with children, children lose a sense of community. They lose the understanding that your neighbors will look out for you. And for me, that's always the most disturbing, that children grow up thinking nobody looks out for anybody else. And you know, for anybody who's as old as I am and grew up in different times in Sri Lanka or anywhere else in the world where there is no conflict, you know that women especially depend so much on other women to pick up on you, to take care of your kids if you're not home, to give the children a meal, to take them in if you say, I'm going to be late tonight and can you just keep an eye. And to lose that sense of community and that sense of feeling safe where you live, I think that's something that a lot of women deal with, and that's something that's a really strong consequence of living in conflict situations. And the third piece, of course, is the broader piece, which is about the structural and institutional problems of becoming used to living in undemocratic situations, becoming used not to claim your rights, not to have a freedom of expression or opinion, not to have freedom of mobility, to become used to living sheltered, silenced, restricted lives and saying, well, that's the way it is. And I think, again, we look at issues of freedom of expression and opinion, and when people, men and women, live with silencing and self-silencing for an extended period of time, it becomes really difficult to imagine that one can speak up, one can fight against injustice, one can claim rights and so forth. So it's in this context then, I think, that a lot of what's in the report that you have in your hands today, trying to look at what women have done and actually accomplished. And so the first case that I wanted to share with you is a Sri Lankan case. It is about an organization which is called the Association of War-Affected Women. It was started by a woman, a very ordinary housewife from the central province, whose two sons were in the army, and one of them went missing. And interestingly enough, for whatever reasons in her character, she thought, well, I'm going to try and find out what happened to him. And in the course of going to military headquarters, she began to encounter many other women who were in the same situation, looking for sons and husbands and brothers, and created this association. And it was very interesting because they were mothers, they were family members of the army, therefore the government and the security forces had great respect for them. At the same time, they were in some ways articulating a concern that was similar for women in the north and east whose sons were perhaps being abducted and disappeared by those sons. And so I remember when she first was working with us, she came to me and she said, I want to do a demonstration in Colombo, and I want to do it with women from the north and east, with Tamil women. And I told her, you must be crazy. Your sons are the ones who are abducting and disappearing their sons. You know, where is the common cause? And, you know, in all my wisdom of 20 years of working as a human rights defender, and so it's a great lesson learned for me, because regardless of what I said and of what everybody else said, she went ahead. She went to Jaffna, she talked to women, and there was this really fabulous moment in which there were like 500 women, at least 200 came from the north and east, Tamil women, minority women, at a time when the war was going on, at a time when emergency regulations made it really hard for Tamil women to come to the south of the country, at a time when people were really afraid of doing demonstrations. There were these Sinhalese women, mothers of soldiers, Tamil women whose sons have been disappeared by soldiers, standing together and saying, where are our sons? You know, the powers that be, you know. Then it was so funny because they had the name of Prabhakaran, who was the leader of the LTT, they had the name of the president, they had the name of the prime minister, and they just said, tell us, we want to know where our children are. A second example is just about the sheer bravery and audacity of women. And it's from the northeast of India, where for many years women's groups and civil society organizations have been struggling against something called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is a special law that allows for military control of large parts of the north and east of India, the 7 small states, right? Assam, Meghalaya, Nagaland, Manipur, Tripura, wherever. So women there was a abduction, rape, and murder of a woman activist, Manorama. And in response, there was a lot of public activism in Delhi and outside, but nobody actually really dared to do anything in Imphal, where the armed forces base is. And then there's a group of women with a long history called the Mirabaibis, the women. They wear a pink sarong and a white top. They were created during the British time when the British were trying to prevent people from consuming alcohol. So they had a very primitive system of keeping guard over their villages at night to make sure that no outsiders would enter. And if the women would keep guard two at a time, and they would start making a signal so that then other people would wake up and they would defend their village or their community. So a group of 15 women went to the camp. It's a big military camp, and before you knew what, they had stripped, and there were 15 naked women standing in front of the army camp in Imphal, and they were shouting out, "Rape us. Rape us if you dare. Come out of the camp. Let's see. Let's see what kind of men you are. Come on and rape us. You raped and killed her." And really, these, when I first saw the pictures, everyone should look at it. There's a little video online. It's really brilliant, because when I first saw it, these are old women with sagging breasts and, bodies that have obviously borne many children. And I could imagine that none of them had ever been naked in their lives. Because you know how it is in our communities, women bathe, dressed. You never take off your clothes. So I was just astounded, and I thought, gosh, what cheek, what audacity, and what courage to do that, and what inspired them to do that thing that probably was an unthinkable thing to do in terms of who they were and from where they came. And I think it was just that sense of outrage and injustice that really moved them. And I always feel very inspired by that. And there's a third story, which is a sad story. It again, I was reminded of it because in the report there's a story from women in the Balkans talking about how difficult it is to talk about what happens to you in a conflict situation, especially when it's about sexual violence. And I remembered being at the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993 and listening to a very old South Korean woman talking about having been held as a sexual slave, servicing members of the Japanese army during the Second World War. And she was 80 plus. It had taken her 50 years to speak, but she spoke. And in the commission that was set up in East Timor, they had a special session on women, and women testified. And there was one woman who testified, and I was just so struck by her logic, because she said she was a woman who had 3 children by she didn't know who, and she had spent the days during the occupation of Timor-Leste by the Indonesian army and by various militias as the mistress of one or the other of the military. And she said, I thought about it, and it was better to be raped by one man every day than to be raped by a different man every day. And that was a choice I made. I really hope that people will take the report, read it, and that you, Nobuko and Kiran, and all of you who work within the UN system and with UNFPA, when you begin looking at how you take this report forward, that you are inspired by what women do, and also have a strong sense of how much expectation there is in the world about what an agency like the UNFPA can do if it really puts its mind to it.